Hi, good evening, everyone. I can see people just beginning to filter in, so welcome. Thanks for joining us at this very dark point of the day, and welcome to our last So What seminar of the year. We have a few dotted around the year, and the last one is always a bit of a overview of what we've learned in the last year. So the title of our seminar today is So What Have We Learned from the Last Year of Research, a focus on inequalities, prevention and youth crime and violence. You should be aware, but we're recording tonight's session, and we will be making the recording available on our YouTube channel, and we'll also share slides with all participants afterwards. You can also access the closed captions if that's helpful. And if you have any questions as you go, we're going to have a panel at the end, so please do put your questions in the Q&A area, and Martha will masterfully steer us through those questions in the panel later on. If we just go on to the next slide, please. So just to show you a bit of a rundown, at the moment I'm giving you the introduction, and then we've got three speakers: Julian Edbrooks-Charles, who's going to speak to us about supporting young people affected by crime and violence, Mia Eisenstadt, who will talk about young people's resilience and inequalities in digital mental health, and Sean Liverpool, who'll be talking about young carers' experiences and outcomes in low and middle income countries. So hopefully we'll have time to have a quick break. Sometimes it's very quick and we just get time to stand up, turn around and sit down again. But we always like to give enough time for our Q&A panel, which will include the speakers and one of our young champions today. And then we'll just have a few reflections at the end. So yeah, that's our kind of rundown. If we can move to the next slide, perhaps we can just ask everybody who's with us today, if those who are named on the slide maybe just pop their camera on for a minute, just so that people might be able to see you in the chat. Fantastic. So as I said, my name's Jess Dayton. I'm Director of Applied Research and Evaluation at Anna Freud. I'm also a Professor of Child Mental Health and Wellbeing at UCL, and kind of marrying those two roles together, I'm Director of the Evidence-Based Practice Unit, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. And also we've got, who's going to be presenting in a bit, Julian Edbrooks-Charles, who's also co-director of the Evidence-Based Practice Unit. I can't see you, Julian, but if you want to give everyone a wave. He's also head of evaluation at Anna Freud and Professor of Evidence-Based Child and Adolescent Mental Health at UCL. We also have Mia Eisenstadt, who is a research associate who did her PhD with us at EBPU and still maintains close links, and it's great to still be working with you and hearing about some of your wider research, Mia. And Sean Liverpool, who I don't think is with us yet actually, but will be joining us a little while later, who also did his PhD with EBPU and is now a lecturer in child and adolescent mental health and wellbeing. And we also have for one of our Anna Freud young champions, Gigi. If you want to give everyone a wave. And we also have Martha, who'll be chairing our panel session later on. Martha, do you want to say hi? Great. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So as I said, I would describe a bit more about the Evidence-Based Practice Unit. We've been around for quite some time now, probably coming up for about 17 years. We've always been sort of a collaboration between Anna Freud as a child mental health charity and the Faculty of Brain Sciences at UCL, which means that we're often in the business of doing quite applied research, bridging the world of sort of more academic research and innovative practice in children's mental health. Within Anna Freud, we work closely with the Child Outcomes Research Consortium, or CORC, and they are the UK's leading membership organisation, collecting and using evidence to improve children and young people's mental health and well-being. And we have a sort of number of core principles in the Evidence-Based Practice Unit, which we've used for a good few years now. We pin all of our kind of research themes around risk, resilience, change and choice. So you'll see that each time we release our key findings report, which is what we're going to be talking a bit more about today, it's very much themed around those four areas. If we just want to move on again. And just to give a bit of background to the So What seminars themselves, we have these a few periods throughout the year, so we'll probably have another one in the spring. And what we try to do, based on the ethos of the evidence-based practice unit, is to think about how we try and bring all of our research into a sort of real world arena and think about what does it mean for the child in front of you, or what does it mean for everyday practice? How is what we learn from our research relevant to those working day in, day out with children and young people and their families? And also, how can you also challenge us in terms of making our work more applicable to those sort of out there working in those spaces? If you want to move on again. So our key findings report, as I said, sticks to those 4 principles of risk, resilience, change and choice. And what we try and do is give some research highlights in this booklet each year, just as a sort of a look back in the year, if you like. And we bring up some of our sort of themes that have sort of been emerging through that period. So while those are all around those 4 sort of prongs, we also see sort of shifts and new areas of work that we begin to focus on. And we've been really noticing that there's been a lot of our focus being taken up by particularly focusing on young people affected by youth crime and violence in the last year, and also a real focus on prevention and early intervention, and what might be more innovative but also more sort of embedded models of prevention. So those are some of those themes you might see coming up in today's discussions. Next slide. Great. So I think that's probably enough for me for now. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all our speakers. Without further ado, I should pass on to you, Julian, as our first speaker.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jess. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name's Julian. I'm Julian Edbrook-Childs. My pronouns are he, him. And today I wanted to talk you through one of our priority areas, which is around supporting young people affected by crime and violence. And today I really just wanted to share a couple of our projects and a few things that we've learned over the course of the year. So moving on to the next slide, I'll just start to set a bit of the scene. So in 21-22, there were almost 55,000 children who were arrested in England and Wales. And of these children, about 5,000 received a caution and 17,000 proceeded to court. And these court proceedings resulted in about 7,500 community sentences, just over 500 custodial sentences, and about 3,000 other sentences. So all of these numbers correspond to about 8,000 first-time entrants to the youth justice system. And one point I found particularly interesting when digging into these statistics, about 64% of these arrests of children were for sexual offences, and this has been a dramatic increase from the previous year. And the next highest number of offences was for violence against the person, which was around 18%. So I think this increase is something that really warrants further attention around why we're seeing more arrests for sexual offences. And perhaps this is something we'll be talking more about in our key findings next year. Moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight why this area is such a priority for us. And one of the key reasons behind this is the real overrepresentation of vulnerable groups we see in those involved in the youth justice system. So the Office for National Statistics did a really interesting piece of descriptive analysis, and they compared young adults. So they took young adults who were born in the academic year 1994, and then they compared those people born in that year who went on to become involved in the justice system and those who didn't become involved in the justice system. And they did this by looking at linked educational and criminal records. So what they found was that compared to young adults not involved in the justice system, those young adults who were involved in the justice system and went on to receive either a custodial or non-custodial sentence, this group were overrepresented by a number of vulnerable groups. So we saw much lower levels of educational attendance and attainment in those involved in the justice system. We saw higher levels of non-mainstream education, so things like pupil referral units or alternative provision settings. And we saw much higher levels of eligibility for free school meals and social care experience in terms of child in need and child looked after status. Sadly, unsurprisingly, we saw higher levels of Black Caribbean and Black African young people being represented in this group. And then finally, we saw really stark differences in levels of special educational needs that had been identified at some point during schooling. So almost 80% of those young adults who were involved in the justice system and received a custodial sentence, almost about 80% of those had special educational needs identified during schooling. When looking at those young adults who were not involved in the justice system, only about 4% of them had special educational needs identified during schooling. One other important point that's really crucial to highlight in our work in thinking about how we can support children affected by crime and violence is how important it is to not adultify these children and to really bear in mind the stigma that is involved in being associated with or being perceived as likely to be associated with involvement in crime and violence. So moving on to think about some of the research that we've been conducting. So we did a systematic review, so a comprehensive literature search that looked at other systematic reviews. And here we were trying to identify the constructs or factors across the ecological system. So whether it was more individual factors, family factors, right the way through to societal factors. So we were interested in seeing these factors that had evidence of being associated with involvement in crime and violence for children aged between 6 to 18 years. So we identified almost 5,000 records, and through our screening processes, we ended up including 30 previous reviews. From these reviews, we identified a huge number of different factors. So we found 22 protective factors or strengths and a whopping 75 needs associated with being involved in crime and violence. So on the next slide, I just summarize a few of these to give you a flavor, and you can find the full paper in our reference list, and I think a link will be posted in the chat. But some of the protective factors we found had more consistent evidence of being associated with not being involved in crime and violence, with the rejection or absence of drug or alcohol use, having positive family relationships and support, and having the availability of education or employment opportunities. Needs with more consistent evidence of being associated with involvement in crime and violence were low empathy, dating abuse, whether it was perpetration or victimization, and bullying perpetration. And given the range of different factors we found that were associated with involvement in youth crime and violence, one of our conclusions was about how important it is to identify at an early stage the individual strengths and needs for a child so that these needs can be met and strengths built upon by the network of adults around the child at an early stage before these vulnerabilities, if not addressed, can have negative outcomes. On the next slide, I want to talk about a different study. So here we were interested in hearing from young people about their experiences of being involved in the youth justice system. And we did this by doing interviews and focus groups with 28 children. And these were children who were in secure accommodation, so places like young offending institutions and secure children's homes. So we were going in and speaking to young people, and this was part of a larger scale program being implemented in these settings. And one core component of that program was the implementation of co-produced formulations. So this is where professionals were going down to sit with children and talk about their stories, to have an understanding of the strengths and needs of that individual child that was in the secure accommodation. One of the key things we heard in the next slide was the critical importance of being able to tell their story through this formulation process. And the impact that this process had on the relationships that children had with staff. So here we can see a quote from a child who was saying, "For me, it really releases quite a lot of stuff that I've built up inside over the years, and it kind of eases that a bit because it's out in the open. And staff can look at that whenever they need to look at that, and I think that helps." Another point the children were telling us was how it was an empowering process to be able to tell your story. Every professional in that room listened to me. They were interested in my feelings rather than just telling me how I am, how I behave, and how they want me to change it. Finally, the children were saying how this process helped to build positive relationships with staff, because staff now understood them, they understood the child more than just the reasons they were in the secure accommodation, for example. It was that formulation meeting, it tells them a bit more about me. So I'm not just some criminal, I'm actually a person to them now. In the next slide, along our whistle-stop tour, I'm going to talk about a current piece of work that we're doing, where we're leading the qualitative strand of a cluster randomized control trial. So this is a trial that's being led by Professor Imran Rasool and Dr. Sarah Catton at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And it's a trial that's looking at a cognitive behavior therapy informed violence reduction program. So what this means is that in this trial, teams of youth practitioners based in local authority settings, these teams are randomly allocated by chance. So 50% of them will be allocated to continue their existing ways of working with children, whereas the other 50% will be trained in the Your Choice programme. This program involves a 5-day training for youth practitioners in cognitive behavior therapy informed techniques, strategies, principles, and practitioners receive a handbook, a compendium of different resources, and they're followed up by monthly supervision by a clinical lead. So after going on this training, practitioners work with children and young people, and they work with them over a course of about 12 to 18 weeks. And they work with them in a different way than they had been previously. And it's a more intensive way of working with up to 3 different sessions. And the aim of having this more intensive contact is to build a really trusting and authentic relationship. And by having this bedrock of this strong relationship, it enables them to incorporate these CBT techniques and tools in their interactions with children. So it's the application of therapeutic tools and techniques, but in non-therapeutic settings. And they can draw on a range of different engaging activities, whether it's things like go-karting or working on educational and employment skills, but they can use these different ways of engaging with children through interactive activities to then incorporate these CBT tools and techniques to enable the young person to have a better understanding of themselves, but to also hopefully equip them with some coping strategies, ultimately to empower them to bring in different patterns of behaviour. So we've recently published a pilot report, which you can find in the references and that will be linked to, so you can see a bit more about what we found in this pilot study. And on the next slide, I wanted to just highlight a quote from some of the qualitative work we did. And it was really both interesting and disheartening to really see the tangible impact that the stigma I was reporting earlier really had on young people and how much they felt it. So here we can see a young person saying, obviously people are going to be seeing me coming in and out of it, so referring to the place where they went to see their practitioner. And it makes you feel ashamed because they're going to take a wild guess and guess correct that you're in there for something bad as a youth. So we can see that this is really playing on their mind and potentially impacting their ability to engage in these settings. On the next slide, we can again see how the relationships young people had with staff, as I talked about in the earlier piece of research, how again, this was really a fundamental ingredient of change. So we have a young person saying, when I was first coming in, I wasn't really comfortable and stuff like that. I would keep things to myself that I could have told the practitioner. But when I first told the practitioner something and I saw that they were helping me, that they was willing to help me with stuff, it made me feel more comfortable over time to a point where I was just coming and telling my practitioner all my situations and stuff. So to wrap up my talk today on the next slide, I wanted to do so just by reiterating the theme I've been talking about today, which was around the overrepresentation of vulnerable groups when it comes to young people involved in the youth justice system. So here our colleagues at the Institute for Physical Studies, going back to the Your Choice pilot, they did a descriptive comparison of strengths and difficulties, total difficulty score. So this is a broad indicator of internalizing and externalizing difficulties for young people. And here they compared the pattern of scores we saw in the 250 or so young people in our Your Choice pilot. So these were young people who were more likely to be affected by youth crime and violence. And what our colleagues did was they compared that profile to a more general population sample of young people taken from a big cohort study that's called the Millennium Cohort Study. So we can see the pattern of scores in red from the Your Choice study, and then the pattern of scores from the Millennium Cohort Study in blue. And what we're seeing is that we have our Your Choice pattern is much more towards the right of the graph. And this is really showing us that we're seeing much higher levels of internalizing and externalizing difficulties for the young people who were involved in our study when it compared to the sample of young people taken from the more general population. So hopefully I've covered a few of the things that we've learned and given you a snapshot of some of our studies that we've conducted this year that are on our topic of how we can support young people affected by crime and violence. In the next slide, we can just see the references from the presentation. And then finally, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you again for coming today. Thank you for your attention. And finally, I will hand back over to Jess to take us into our next session.
Thanks so much, Julian. It's really good to see such a breadth of work in this area. I know you've been really instrumental in pushing us forwards on this, and really nice to see just the voice of the young people really come to the fore with some of those quotations as well. Thank you for that. Right, we should move on without further ado. Mia is going to talk to us about young people's resilience and inequalities and digital mental health. So over to you, Mia.
Thanks, Jess, and hello, everybody. Good evening. Okay, so as Jess mentioned, I'm a research associate at the Evidence-Based Practice Unit, and I'm also the creator of an app called Fatherly, which is an app for dads to support them with their parenting and well-being. Right, so if we could move on to the next slide. So one of the things we're really interested in at the Evidence-Based Practice Unit is what helps some young people be resilient and what stops others from being able to overcome difficult circumstances in life. And so that's basically what resilience is. Resilience is a dynamic process which leads to positive adaptation, even in the context of adversity. And what we're really interested as per Julian's talk as well, is to identify the factors that can aid resilience for young people so that they do have positive outcomes in spite of having difficult circumstances, as well as understand in more detail the way that factors can also increase risk of negative outcomes, whether it's a mental health disorder or engaging in risky behavior or even sort of criminal activities, as Julian was exploring. So if we can go to the next slide. So we've had a huge opportunity to be able to study resilience in young people through the Head Start program. And Head Start was set up in response to the fact that at the time, as much as 1 in 8 children and young people were at risk of experiencing a diagnosable mental health issue. This statistic is now 1 in 5 based on the NHS digital statistics that were just released I think last week. So in this program, 6 Head Start partnerships, so Blackpool, Cornwall, Hull, Kent and Newham and Wolverhampton from across England received funding from the Big Lottery to promote mental health and well-being in children and early adolescents, so the 10 to 16 period. And these could include tailored school and community-based targeted and universal interventions, generally taking a whole school approach towards mental health and well-being. And this involved £65 million of funding over 5 years, spread out amongst the 6 partnerships. And those interventions in schools and in communities now finished last year in the summer. So if we can go to the next slide. So we're really interested to understand how Head Start had been qualitatively experienced by young people. And we're particularly interested to understand the sort of diversity of experience and whether the programme had worked for some and not for others, and why that might be. So if we go to the next slide. So I'm sharing with you this recent paper that I think one of the team will put in the chat, published this year. And it's based on analysis of data from 82 interviews in 1 year and 78 interviews the following year with the same young people, the same participants. So each year we asked young people about the difficult situations that they experience in their lives and how they cope with them, and then what are their existing forms of support. And then in the second time point, we were asking, had this changed or had it stayed the same, to understand sort of risk factors that might be going across time versus things that were sort of situational. And it's worth noting that many in this sample of 82 adolescents experienced high levels of risk, so multiple risk factors, compared to a young person in sort of average population. And the sort of stresses that young people were dealing with were things like family breakdown, bullying, lots of peer conflict, low socioeconomic status, and issues with anger, confidence, and regulating emotions. So if we go to the next slide. So we used a qualitative methodology to analyze the data. We used thematic analysis where we developed themes of the experiences of Head Start support to try and capture that sort of diversity of what they'd experienced. And then we catalogued their experiences of Head Start against the sources of support that they had in their lives that they told us about. So it's all based on qualitative data. And then we formed a framework based on the extent that young people found Head Start either helpful or unhelpful, and the sort of gradations in between. And it's worth pointing out that we're aware that the interviews we had with young people were just 30 minutes to an hour at just one point in a child's life. So obviously what may be happening in people's lives may change sort of day to day. And then secondly, we're also aware that our social identities affect the data collection process. So we were outsiders to the different locations. We were adults. There were many differences in our own demography and social identities that separated us from the young people we were interviewing. So that can affect the data as well. So we go to the next slide. So we found 5 groups of experiences of Head Start. So first of all, there were young people who had a really positive or helpful experience of Head Start support. So it could have been a peer mentor, it could have been a group therapy program, it could have been a family program. So it was a range of interventions that were available, and they differed across the 6 sites. So for instance, this young person said it was just like for fun, like I could talk to a person and they would understand me completely. The second group were adolescents who wanted more support. They valued the support and they would like more of it. And then the third group were adolescents who described mixed or unhelpful experiences of support. Now, when I think about it, it didn't really help me. I benefited from it a little bit, but not really a lot, said a female that we interviewed. And then fourthly, there was the adolescents who may not need support, and reported little or no support, or in fact didn't even remember if they had received support or not. And finally, there were adolescents who reported receiving little support or no support, but who may needed quite a lot of support. So these would tended to be adolescents who had multiple stressors in their lives. So if we go to the next slide, please. So we were really interested in understanding from young people's point of view what makes interventions helpful and what makes them unhelpful. So we called them the helpful factors, bridges, and then the unhelpful factors were the walls. So young people said that developing and coping and problem solving skills was very helpful, and they really valued that about the programs they were part of, and having someone to talk to, which also kind of chimes with Julian's findings in the previous talk. And then also having fun, and then also noticing a difference. So after participating in an intervention for a period of time, feeling more confident or having more friends or feeling a more sense of belonging. And then at the same time, there are a number of walls. And so some of the walls included around what was making interventions less helpful to young people were sort of uncertainty and transitory. So this is when young people didn't know why they'd been put into a session, or they didn't remember a session, or didn't know if there was going to be another session, or why their friend was experiencing it or was selected for a session and they weren't. Another one was around issues around group dynamics. So when there was kind of disruption in the sessions, or there was people felt they weren't getting on with others in the group or with the facilitator. Another factor was unsuitable location or timing, and then additionally problematic content or format, and questionable or limited utility. So for instance, one young person said, we've done a bit about violence and law and mental health, and that made me a bit stressed and worried. So obviously that had the opposite effect that it was potentially aiming to have for young people. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the takeaway from this study is that effective support is complex. Providing effective support is very complex, and more is needed. So for some young people that had the opportunity to experience the Head Start interventions, they found it really helpful. It helped with their confidence. It helped having a trusted person to go to. It helped them cope with difficult situations, and it increased their resilience. For others, the support was either not right or not enough, and the needs for support remained high. So this is sort of the Goldilocks issue of support, you know, it needs to be different for everyone. It could be too much or too little, and you need to find the support that's just right. And then also it's important to remember that each young person comes to an intervention with a unique profile of the issues that's going on in their lives, as well as the support that they either have or don't have. And interventions really need to take that on board. Great, if we could go to the next slide. So the second study I'd like to share with you is around digital mental health apps. And as you're probably aware, the use and production of digital mental health apps drastically increased within the pandemic, and particularly amongst young people. However, as we found in a systematic review, most studies of digital mental health apps have been conducted with mainly white, middle-class participants, limiting what can be generalized to other communities. And so research is needed with ethnic minorities. And as is the case, that culture, race, and ethnicity is often overlooked in psychology research. So we could go to the next slide, please. So our study is looked at self-guided mental health apps that deliberately targeted racial and ethnic minority groups. And this study was led by Phoebe Saad, who was a master's student on the MSc Anna Freud program. And what we wanted to do was explore the acceptability of mental health apps, but also understand their possible effectiveness and why they could be used, and also to identify any barriers and find any gaps for future research. So if we go to the next slide. So why is this important, given there is not much research in this area? So racial and ethnic minority groups are at increased risk of poor mental health and experience inequalities in accessing mental health care, and may be at risk of low socioeconomic status and discrimination and racism. And health equity is important because it can be achieved when everyone can attain their full potential for health and well-being. And thus, we're interested in achieving health equity in the space of digital health. And so we were interested to systematically identify and eliminate inequalities resulting from differences in healthcare provision and research ultimately. And this paper is a very small step towards that goal. So barriers amongst racial and ethnic groups in accessing services include a lack of mental health literacy, lack of suitable services, concerns around confidentiality, social stigma, financial factors, and lack of trust in service providers. If we can go to the next slide, please. And what we found was that 15 publications met our inclusion criteria when we were looking for studies on apps that targeted ethnic and racial and ethnic minorities. And most of the studies were conducted in the USA. And there was a number of apps that include Activate, iBobbly, Aim High, Y, Brave, and BYOD. And so most of them were based on CBT and aimed on reducing depressive symptoms or other types of internalizing symptoms. So could include things like suicidal ideation. And then some apps were deliberately targeted to a particular group. And then others were created to be universal for everyone. But then when the language of the app was changed, they were then found to be particularly acceptable amongst a particular population. For instance, the IPST app was found to be particularly used by the Hispanic population in a particular study. And so as with most mental health apps, there's a high rate of deleting an app after sort of 2 or 3 weeks. So the engagement did tend to sort of tail off after the first few weeks, but this is really common to research on apps. And then barriers to usage included things like repetitive material, privacy concerns, and technical issues. Go to the next slide, please. And so just here you can see a few example studies. So some of the existing apps out there that have been studied have targeted ethnic minorities from the Hispanic community, from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, Asian Americans, Indigenous Australians, and tend to be in the US, Canada, Netherlands, and Australia, and there's a few more from America. So if we move to the next slide, please. So that's it in terms of that study. What we sort of found is that while there is some acceptability, generally there's a huge lack of apps that are designed specifically for a minority ethnic group, and often culturally appropriate ways of sharing knowledge of mental health and treatment was important for individuals from a particular ethnic group. And given that mental health issues can be particularly relevant in some of these different communities, it's important to explore different ways of potentially providing treatment and increasing access. There was only one study in the UK, and that was of an app that targeted the Jamaican community. And so the range and diversity of ethnic minority groups is not reflected in the literature on digital mental health apps. And so we don't know if digital mental health apps work for everyone, but definitely more research is needed to be able to understand if there's more promise that can be provided through digital forms of support, because this area is under-researched. And also apps do need to be used in conjunction with other forms of support, especially for serious mental health symptoms like suicidal ideation. And then there is a potential for apps and digital mental health to overcome some barriers and some stigma through the privacy that mental health apps can afford. Next slide, please. So thanks very much for listening. If you want to contact me, you're welcome to email me or find me on Twitter. The papers that I mentioned in this short talk, the first one is available and the link is in the chat, and the second one will be available from JMR Mental Health in the next few days. So thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Thanks so much, Mia. Really interesting stuff. And yeah, inequalities was another one of our themes that came in really strongly this year in our findings. So thank you for that. Just a reminder to everybody, please do put questions in the Q&A as we go. You may have forgotten them by the end, and also we will just pull them out of the chat rather than, sorry, we will pull them from the Q&A rather than asking you to sort of shout them out. So yeah, if you can be doing that as you go, that'd be great. Okay, without further ado, we should hand on to Sean Liverpool. It's great to see you again, Sean. I haven't seen you for a long time, but yeah, really looking forward to what you've got to say.
So this evening, I just wanted to kind of quickly share some information about a study that I really co-created with young people with lived experience of being young carers. So this study originated, I would say, about a year ago, when I started presenting some findings from studies where I looked at the mental health of children and young people in the Caribbean. And I was particularly looking at some factors that influence their mental health, because the literature around what was quite limited. So I presented at a couple places, and afterwards, a young man approached me and asked if we could have a conversation. And he said something like what you did in the Caribbean is also needed for countries in Africa, for example, Nigeria and Kenya. And I said, oh, that's interesting, and I'm happy to hear a bit more about it. So a couple weeks after, we had a Teams call, and he was just sharing that some of the factors might be similar to the context of Africa, but yet there are some differences, because what was not highlighted in the Caribbean study was the type of young people that were struggling, and young carers did not come up as one of them. So he said, in African countries, for example, so many young children are considered young carers because they're taking care of their parents and grandparents for many different reasons. So he wondered if we can do something similar, which was a scoping review in that case. Of course, I said yes at the time. And then we were kind of exploring what expertise might be needed to carry out this study. So we had a bit of exploration, and we identified that we might need some support from a librarian, we might need a research assistant. So I was the one kind of putting resources in place to help support this young man with lived experience of being a young carer, because I think it was quite necessary, because not often we are approached by young people with lived experience to participate in research. Usually it was the other way around. So I was quite excited to facilitate this. Outside of this, we also recruited someone with lived experience of being a young carer as well, to kind of be like the patient and public involvement lead while we go through the study as well. So I'll just tell you a bit more about what we found at the early stages of the study, and then talk you through a bit about our findings as well. So next slide, please. So at the beginning, it was important for us to think about what we already know, and from the international context, because we could have seen from a quick Google search that there was not much evidence from low and middle income countries. So trying to focus on African countries only would not have been a good place to start. So we looked at the broader literature, and we first was trying to define what young carers are in the literature to see if it was similar to what our lived experience expert was thinking. So we confirmed that young carers provide informal care to sick or aging family members and relatives. And the lived experience experts agreed that that's the definition we can use to guide our study. We noticed that in the literature that young carers are estimated to be between 2% and 8% of young people. And most of that would have come from the UK and the US. The literature was quite alarming on the negative impact being a young carer had on young people. And this went from physical impact, mental health impact, including depression and anxiety. And we confirmed that there was limited evidence based on a recent systematic review that concluded that there were no studies available from low and middle income countries to highlight mental health disorders among this population. So we found that quite interesting, and it helped us guide the rest of the study. So I'll just talk you through a bit about how the study was conducted on the next slide, please. So up until April of 2023, we wanted to know anything and everything there is about young carers from low and middle income country. So we conducted a wide search, and we were focusing on children and young people up to the age of 24 years. And this was simply because the literature we had already found stopped at 18 years. And our lived experience expert said it might be unfair to young people who are 19 years, because he thinks most of the young carers were also affected by not being able to attend universities or colleges and so forth. So if it was possible to extend the age to 24. So that was quite a helpful tip for us, that we needed to look at the literature from low and middle income countries with a different lens compared to what was already available. And the key goal of it all was to summarize and synthesize the key points from the literature that was available, because at the point we had known very little. So we just thought we'll bring together everything and offer something to the international body of evidence. Next slide, please. So Interestingly, we found only 20 publications that met our inclusion criteria published within the last 20 years. So the first one was in 2020, and most recent one in March of this year as well. Most of the studies were in African countries, particularly Kenya, which had the most studies, I think roughly 8 studies or so, with a couple from Malaysia, Pakistan, and Mexico. And young carers were as young as 5 years old and all the way up to 24 years. And they cared for parents, grandparents, and other elderly relatives as well. So this is kind of like the overview of what we found. And I'll then tell you a bit about the particular themes and highlight some of the inequalities or differences compared to the wider literature as well. So next slide, please. So in terms of the overarching themes, the first one that came out was around sociocultural expectations. And it was highlighted that young carers in low and middle income countries had this expectation placed on them by society and also by other family members. So if you were the sibling or the child of someone who was aging or ill, there's an expectation from your cultural or environment or neighborhood that you would be the one to take care of them. And although this added some pressures on the young person to adopt that role of being a young carer, they also saw it as a badge of honor. There was a sense of pride that came with caring for your relative as well. So we started to see that narrative coming out that was sort of different to the messages that we had from when we started the study. And it was, luckily for us, we had the lived experience expert who was able to confirm some of our thinking around these themes as well. We were able to kind of summarize information around the care and responsibilities. And similar to high-income countries where it was personal care, administering medication, preparing food and meals for sick family members, they were doing these responsibilities with very low resources. So some of the studies highlighted that although they had to prepare meals for family members, they had to go miles away to get water or to use to actually grow fruits and vegetables in their garden then to prepare it. So there was additional work that had to happen in order to carry out these responsibilities as well. In terms of education, most of the young carers had to leave school, or they were doing very poorly in school, which eventually led to dropping out from school. And this kind of coincided with this concept around early employment as well. So they were sort of leaving education settings to go into early employment because of the lack of resources and the financial strains that was on the family, to have some sort of income to support the household and even to support siblings that were in the household as well if they were caring for parents. This also linked to social connections. Because they were leaving school so early on, or earlier than expected, the social connections with friendship groups and friendship circle were being impacted negatively. However, they were developing emotional bonds with family members who were probably would eventually pass away, or with other family members by caring, because they were offering some sort of emotional support as well to their ailing family member. And they saw that they were developing a deeper connection. However, their social connection were not with people around their age group. It was with older relatives. And lastly, the key theme around the mental, physical, and emotional health and well-being. We saw some negative impact, not so much in the space of being named mental health, but emotional health were impacted by loneliness, which was led on from the social connections that was being impacted from schools. But we also saw reduced self-esteem and isolation, and themes that were popping up from not being in schools or not being around people who they wanted to play games with or to have child-friendly activities with. So they were more in adult circles, which made them feel a bit isolated. And interestingly for this theme, because the recent systematic review highlighted that there were no studies in this area, particularly focused on mental health, the lived experience expert confirmed this and said, this is what we were expecting. You're not expecting depression and anxiety from low and middle income countries, because this is not something that's prioritized in the culture. but you would find factors that influence mental health outcomes, which was the link to the Caribbean study that I did before. So he was quite not excited about this, but quite keen to point out that maybe we need to focus on the factors that are influencing mental and emotional health. And it may be less helpful to look for mental health factors or mental health disorders in low and middle income countries for young people. Next slide, please. We just wanted to point out the strength of the evidence as well. So all of the themes had at least 6 publications highlighting these themes. So it helped us increase our confidence in our findings as well. And just from this one, we wanted to point out that the sociocultural expectations, which we had a lot of discussion around because we wasn't sure if that would emerge as a full theme, if it was just discussed by one group of people. But in 6 publications, we were able to see this being repeated more and more, that this is something we need to look into as well. So this is just a visual representation of the themes that we identified. Next slide, please. So in terms of how these key findings from our co-design study and really co-created and co-produced, because one of the lived experience experts became an author, so we co-authored the paper as well. And we wanted to point out that this sociocultural expectation might be similar to young carers in high-income countries. So we particularly looked at what this would look like, and it started to play out in some studies in the US and at least one study in the UK that highlighted this sense of pride that was arising around ethnic minority young carers in these countries as well. So although the findings might be specific to low and middle income countries, we think some of the key findings might apply to young carers living in high income countries as well. Our findings do align with the wider literature in terms of education, meaning that young carers' education is impacted from this experience, but only partly in terms of employment. So when we look at the studies from high-income countries, young carers are more likely to be unemployed or have poorer employment outcomes later on, whereas for young carers in low and middle income countries, although they were underemployed, they were still seeking some form of employment as opposed to being unemployed. The lived experience expert kind of described this almost like a survival tactic. So not that they would like to work, but they had to work for themselves as well to provide meals and also to take care of their family as well. And the care recipients that we found in low and middle income countries varied widely compared to what we saw in high-income countries. In high-income countries, young carers were more taking care of their parents and maybe at a stretch their grandparents. In low and middle-income countries, young carers took care of relatives that were siblings of their grandparents. One study also highlighted that the young carer was taking care of a neighbor, an elderly gentleman in the neighborhood who had no children to care for him. So that was the responsibility of this young carer, which was quite interesting for us to see because we weren't familiar with that. And the lived experience expert confirmed this, and he said it could be cultural, that because you grow up in a community where people who are your neighbors and who live across the street are seen as uncles and aunts, that you feel the same sense of responsibility to take care of them as they're aging as well. And lastly, just to point out, the impaired physical health that we found would have been things like sleep and nutrition. And in low and middle income countries, nutrition, especially malnutrition and undernourishment, is already quite popular. But for young carers, they were even more so impacted from being a young carer or having that experience of being a young carer, because sleep was impacted by having to care for their siblings and their family members during the course of the night as well. And in terms of emotional health, stigma was still quite common. So when young carers were describing their struggles or the emotional strain of being a young carer, they felt that they couldn't openly talk about that, again, because of the sociocultural expectation that was highlighted with that. But one of the lived experience expert advised us not to see it as a positive, but resilience came up as something that most of the young carers described, and most of the practitioners who work with young carers as well described, that these young people seem to be quite resilient and prepared for the future because of their early experiences of young caring. So where do we go from here with this knowledge? The lived experience expert, luckily, is hoping to go on to do a PhD in this area, to design an intervention that would be particularly acceptable to young carers in low and middle income countries, but delivering it in an online way from being in the UK. So we are currently working together to design a protocol to propose this study in the future. So thank you for listening. I just wanted to share some preliminary findings of what's emerging so far from this really important study that we co-produced with lived experience experts.
Thanks so much, Sean. It's such a fascinating piece of work, and I'm really glad to hear that it's got legs and it's going somewhere else now too. I think the insights that the lived experience experts gave, really fascinating. I really like that thought around perhaps some of those precursors for mental health outcomes being the ones to look out for. But yeah, brilliant. As predicted, we've slightly run out of time for a break. So what I suggest is maybe everyone just stands up where they are, has a bit of a shake of the legs, because I want to make sure we've got enough time for our Q&A session. So just a reminder, I can see we've got one question that's popped into the Q&A. Please do add some more. But perhaps if we can ask all our panel to turn their cameras on, and I will hand over to Martha to chair this part of the session.
Okay, firstly, don't be afraid of the Q&A function. It's your friend. We're here to answer your questions. You're protected behind a screen, don't worry. So obviously, thank you, Sophie, for your question that's there. It's a two-parter that I'm going to throw over to Sean in a sec. But I think to get us started, I think I'd really like to hear from our young champion, Gigi, to kind of get a sense of what they thought about all the things they heard, because that was a lot of different things, and we're going to touch on some of them. But I'd love to hear sort of what you thought of the learning that you've heard and what your kind of takeaway from it was.
Yeah, unfortunately, Julian and Mia's research didn't surprise me, which is sad that it's not surprising. But yeah, one thing I've taken away is actually Mia's presentation has sowed a seed for a dissertation idea for myself, but yeah.
Do you want to share that dissertation idea with us, or are you worried we'll steal it?
Yeah, no, it's about the effectiveness of mental health apps on minority ethnic youth in the UK. So.
Cool. Well, you guys should talk after this. Okay. I can see people are still afraid of the Q&A, so I'm just going to open it up quickly to Sophie's question, and I will keep asking my own questions if other people don't come through, because I've got loads, because there's so much information. So Sean, Sophie had a bit of a two-parter for you, and her question was around, you were mentioning caregiving for sick and aging family members, and they were wondering if that definition included mental illness. And she was also asking sort of for your reflections on young people caring for parents with mental illness and sort of the cultural differences there. So if you want to give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, happy to share. That's a really good question. And just to say, because the topic of mental health was so limited for low and middle income countries, none of the studies we found the young carers were caring for parents with mental illness. So it was more physical ailment. So that was another comparison to high income countries, where we realized in the UK, for example, there were young carers who were caring for parents who had a mental health illness. So quite different in terms of context. Sorry, Martha, I forgot the second part already. It's that
So
time.
it is that time of the day, don't worry. And it's a Monday. So the second part of the question was really to, they were interested in your reflections on young people caring for parents with mental illness, and maybe where that isn't noted. And I think you kind of just answered it around the cultural aspect. I don't know if you've got anything more to say on that at this point.
Just in terms of reflection, I think it might be the same level of impact, whether you're caring for physical or mental health or worse, but we don't have that level of evidence yet. So it might be interesting for future research that's something we need to start looking into.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to give Sean a break for a sec, and I'm going to go over to Mia. So we have quite a specific question here, so hopefully you can answer. So it's a question about CBT. So it says you're offering high CBT at high intensity. So is it the high intensity of someone being with them reflecting Bowlby's core conditions, or the CBT that is leading to the change? I don't know if you can answer that very specific question.
Is that question for Julian, actually?
It is, yes.
Yeah, there we
So I think the intensity refers to the kind of the amount of contact with the young person. So yeah, the idea is to be kind of meeting with the young people up to 3 times a week. And really the aim for having this intense level of contact is to build that strong and authentic and trusting relationship. But also we were hearing from young people, it provided the opportunity to address things kind of live as they were coming up. So they could be kind of, I remember a quote from a young person saying, you know, even if the practitioner couldn't necessarily help, being able to speak to someone and rant and kind of get it off my chest really quickly provided a strong benefit. So I would say the kind of the CBT tools and techniques were trying to be applied in more kind of everyday ways. So I think it was really trying to incorporate those sort of therapeutic practices, tools, coping strategies, but not necessarily kind of badged as a kind of a mental health support, which we know sadly can still be a barrier for some to be able to engage. So I'm not sure I would say it's a intensive CBT. I wouldn't say the CBT is necessarily the intensive part. I would say it's the kind of the amount of sort of contact and ways of working with the young people in which this kind of CBT techniques and tools are used, rather than it being a kind of intensive CBT program. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that distinction well. I think one thing just on that note that I have to say caught me by surprise was just how the level of contact seemed to be doable. It wasn't, I was wondering if that in and of itself might be a barrier to engagement, but actually it seemed to work quite well. And I think being able to draw on this different range of activities, these creative activities, really helped to provide that engagement and provide that flexibility of contact.
Thanks, Julian. That was a really fulsome answer. Thank you. So I'm going to open it up to everyone now, because there's a question in the Q&A I really want everyone to think about. I'm going to kind of pick on Jess and Mia because they haven't had a chance to speak yet. So Rachel Stemp has very kindly popped in the chat. There is a range of evidence beginning to emerge that says that young people are becoming addicted to phones and apps, and these technologies are likely to be linked with poor mental well-being. Is it better for researchers to use technology for good and develop mental health apps and interventions like we've heard about today? Or could using phones for research actually be part of the problem and something to avoid until we know more? Controversial, open-ended, go.
Shall I start with this one, Jess? Yeah, I think it's a great question, and definitely just a key challenge with all sort of technology research. So there's really mixed evidence. So there are some studies that video games can actually decrease anxiety in boys. So there's also gender differences as well. I mean, obviously we're using Zoom now to share this important research and share these questions together. So obviously technology can be used for good, I would say this is a good use of technology right now. I think it's really important for young people to have literacy about the dangers of the internet and dangers of AI as well. When they first released ChatGPT, it was misused in the sense of it was picking up information from sort of anorexia forums and stuff, and used by people with eating disorders to sort of manage an eating disorder. And so that was then correct. Once it was realized that that was happening, that was then corrected in ChatGPT. But there will always be negative ways of using technology, and technology will there's also another big challenge with technology with young people getting scammed online, or sort of abusive and sort of hate comments online and so on. And so there were, I don't know if you followed it, but in the States, there's been some suicides linked to young people being scammed online by organized crime groups. So it is very, very, very serious, the misuse of technology. But I just think you know, it's a horrible metaphor, but I don't think you can throw the baby out with the bathwater. And young people are going to really want to use technology. So it's up to, I think it's up to adults, parents, teachers, anyone who works with young people to really make sure that young people are informed to protect themselves online. And the same goes with sort of use of AI and kind of apps like Snapchat and a lot of the sort of the apps that young people are into and are continually being sort of updated. And but yeah, it'd be good to hear from Gigi as well on this as well. It'd be really interesting.
Yeah, I think, like Mia said, it's really important to use apps in like helping people with their mental health struggles, because it's not the fact that it's a digital application that necessarily makes things bad or is causing any of these mental health problems that are being correlated with things like social media use. So as much as you can look at apps and say, yes, these are creating problems, that doesn't necessarily mean everything online is going to be creating a problem. And therefore, if we create apps with that in mind and knowing that we're trying to solve an issue that some other apps may contribute to, then by design in that app, we're going to try and eliminate any possibility. And I think it's much more about the content of the apps than it being an application, because you can't just say that using apps in general is bad, because we're on an app right now having this meeting, and I think anyone that would try and argue that this seminar is going to like make young people's mental health worse would be trying to argue a point that isn't very, like, it's not going to stand. So yeah,
that was a total mic drop. Thank you, Gigi. I really love the way you summarized that. So I'm going to pivot us slightly because there's a lot of interesting things kicking off in the Q&A. So there's some ones about language and one that Sharon's put in that I'd quite like to get to, which is very difficult for it to answer. But it says, as a progressive panel, nice to hear, why are you still using the term ethnic minorities, minoritized groups, rather than the term Black and global majority? Sharon works for a diverse local authority in London, and they now refer to that term Black and global majority. What's our kind of perspective on this? I know in research, we have lots of thoughts on this. As an organization, we have lots of thoughts. So I'm going to pick on Jess now and see what she's got to say.
I thought you might. But yeah, it might be good to invite Julian in a minute as well, because I know we've had lots of discussions about this in our research, and I think we're mindful that it's an area that's still evolving. We've had lots of conversations around the language that we use, and also the fact that ideally we would like to not use very broad terms. We would like to refer to young people, which is usually who we're talking about, using the sort of language that they would like to use. And it's very rare that we would describe ourselves in terms of a very broad ethnic category. We would probably talk about ourselves as being, I don't know, Bangladeshi or Welsh, or I don't know, whatever somebody's heritage is. And we would try to do that. Often in the research, we are in a position where, for example, with the kind of research that Sean was talking about, where we've got large-scale literature reviews, sometimes we're talking about very broad populations, and we're also sometimes beholden to the language that they use, because we're trying to sort of report accurately what they're what they have done and what they have referred to. And also sometimes we are looking quantitatively at groups that are quite small, and it becomes very difficult to say something specific about those groups. So we do end up using different language. We have talked about, we often use phrases more around minoritized or groups that are often marginalized. So that is language we often refer to. And sometimes we use language and we recognize that actually there probably are better words that we could use, and we change our position. So we try to be quite reflexive about it, but I think that's a helpful challenge for us to think about, maybe perhaps our positioning there. But I don't know if Julian, you wanted to add anything else?
No, I think you've covered everything. I just want to say, yeah, thank you for the comment. I think it's really helpful. And we have our kind of our sort of in-house guidelines about the sort of language we use, and we review it and kind of change it on an ongoing basis. I think, yeah, we've certainly changed it at least once already, if not more. And yeah, I think it's something that, as Jess is saying, it's evolving, and I think we need to kind of evolve with it. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to follow up the conversation after the session. And yeah, I don't want to steal the work that you've done, but it'd be yeah, if there's anything that we can learn from the work that you've been doing, that led to kind of the change in language you were talking about for your organization. Yeah, it would just be really interesting to kind of continue the conversation.
Thanks both. So sticking with the topic of language, I'm going to go over to Sean now. So Prince has asked, essentially, is there a thirst to seek culturally grounded and empowering mental health language for, you know, African and Asian countries in similar contexts that you were talking about in your study?
That's a really good question. I don't know if there's a thirst, but it should be a priority area if we are missing the experiences of children and young people, or people in general, when it comes to mental health. Because stigma seems to still be such a high in that community, in those communities, it might be that we need to revisit the language around mental health, and that could be an area that's of priority. So I think I'd more say it in that way, as opposed to doing more mental health research, but just to understand, or to, yeah, get some clarity on what we are speaking about in that community would be helpful.
Great, thank you. So there's a couple of questions again for Sean, particularly around the participation elements. And I think everybody likes that some young person came to you with these ideas. So there's sort of a couple of questions around how can we encourage this kind of behavior? How can we foster it from a variety of angles? Like, how do we fund this, or think about incentivizing young people? But really, what could we be doing differently to make these kind of conversations happen more, to lead to this kind of work?
I think it was good that the young person I worked with felt empowered to do so, because at the time they were completing their master's project and doing, like, preparing for a dissertation and things like that. But more so from the general public, I wonder if when we present our work, if we could also just leave the opportunity or the space open for young people or people with lived experience to ask us what's next, or how could we be involved in the next steps of this research. So more like, so what and where do we take this next, and how could we help, or what would you like to see? I think that is definitely what worked for us on this study in particular.
Great, thank you. Has anyone else got any other thoughts on that subject around how we empower more young people and create that feeling in the research and have those kind of conversations?
I guess I could just say quickly that sometimes people with lived experience or young people just ask the right questions naturally. They naturally have great questions. So I think, you know, we can either take those questions and run and write them ourselves, or we can, like Sean did, really bring them with us, with them and with us, and it be a sort of joint endeavor. So I think just keeping that dialogue open and also letting, I think sometimes at undergraduate level, or maybe people with lived experience, they don't realize they could be part of a published paper. And so I think trying to encourage co-authorship with people that are at sort of different levels on the academic journey is also great as well. And also in some of the Head Start papers, sort of young people being involved in, you know, looking in the themes or checking sort of frameworks or typologies that we come up with, checking the language, seeing if it makes sense, seeing if it's sort of too many acronyms and meaningless, or whether it actually sort of chimes with their experience. So I think there's loads of ways actually that we can really empower young people and also increase the quality of the research as well.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I think that's been one of our big commitments for the last couple of years, has been trying to make sure that ideally every project would have peer researchers embedded, because they enrich the work so much. And we're trying to get better at not just being consultation process, but being one where we're working alongside experts by lived experience who can sort of help us form the research questions, help us deliver, you know, the field work, and also to understand what we're seeing in terms of the findings, which I really liked your example, Sean, of that, and also to help us disseminate them, you know, really everything in the pipeline. And I think we're getting there, but it's a real culture change, I think, that journey.
Thank you. So we are running low on time. So I'm going to throw a super specific question to Julian, and then I'm going to kick it back to Jess to summarize us and take us out. So Julian, just going back to what you were saying earlier about those very vulnerable groups, there's a question from Susanna about how, you know, there's this huge prevalence of young people in the youth justice system with SEND identified needs. And that was reiterated in your presentation. And really what she was asking is, how can we extend the opportunities for researchers to explore and include the experiences of these young people? A lot of times what is seen is that there'll be studies or pilots or interventions being tested, but actually they exclude special settings. And so then this vulnerable cohort aren't necessarily getting access to these new things or helping to adapt them to what they need.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an excellent question. And I think we are only really beginning to scratch the surface in terms of the things we can be doing. I think, I think it is a real issue in terms of, you know, how we are making our research inclusive, particularly to vulnerable groups and to children and young people with special educational needs. And I think really the issue is sort of across the different stages of the pipeline. I think how we present information about studies. I think how we can ask people about their views and experiences, collect the information from them, I think is very limited, in addition to excluding those voices from the research in a kind of explicit way. I don't know how we can, I don't know how we kind of tackle the big problem. I think it is a big problem. I think one sort of bit of the problem that we're trying to kind of tackle in a study we've not talked about today that we're doing at the moment is really trying to rethink the types of mental health questionnaires that we use for children and young people, but specifically trying to remove some of those barriers that we're talking about. So what we're doing in a project at the moment is to try and develop an image-based mental health measure for young people. So this is where we're trying to kind of move away from the use of text in how we're asking or how we're letting people answer the questions, and to try and use kind of images for that. And one of the kind of key groups we're hoping such an approach would benefit is those with special educational needs. So yeah, we've been through a kind of review of the existing image-based measures. We've done some focus groups, but we're embarking on a series over several months of workshops using a community-based participatory action research design. So this means we'll be working with young people doing the workshops, but there will be both the kind of giving the views, but also setting out how we're going about asking for their views as well. So they're kind of really delivering the research with us. So yeah, hopefully in our key findings next year, there might be something to talk about, and we might have a new type of questionnaire that we're flogging and asking everyone to use. But yeah, and again, I think this is such a big and important problem. If anyone is working on this, if anyone wants to kind of keep this conversation going, please do get in touch with us.
Thanks, Julian. That was a brilliant teaser, setting everybody up for being interested in everything we're doing next year. I just wanted to say a big thank you for everyone for showing their questions and for sharing their thoughts now. And I'm going to pass over to Jess.
Thanks, Martha. Yeah, I think we will have more to say on that next time, because we'll have some work on Be Well around special schools and alternative provision too. Yeah, thanks to all of you. Really fascinating conversation and great presentations. And Gigi, thanks so much for joining us as well. It's really helpful to hear your thoughts and your views. I should also say thank you to Rachel and Bea, who are behind the scenes, making sure that no wheels fall off and that all of the technology is working, that we're all prepped and know what we're doing. So thanks so much for that. I really appreciate you all coming. We really enjoy having these seminars, and it's a really good way of connecting with all of you. It's great to have your questions, but it's also great to have your challenges. And I think I will take away your challenge to us, Sharon, and that might be something we'll probably debate in our equity, diversity and inclusion meetings. I think what certainly Sean and Mia and Julian have demonstrated is, as researchers, we can't just get comfortable where we are. We have to be listening to young people. We have to be aware of the inequalities that are embedded in the way we do our work. If we don't change it, we have to be thinking about who we're excluding if we don't think about our methods of communication, our methods of research. And we have to be reflexive and open to the fact that sometimes we get it wrong and we have to think again. And that's something I think we're, locking onto even more, but we can certainly get better. I should probably just flash up, or Rachel or team, if you could just flash up the last slide. Just to let you know, many of the things that we've talked about do feature to some degree in our key findings booklet. So the links there, when you get the slides through, go and take a look, or you can probably find it on our website anyway. Do follow EBP Unit on Twitter. You will find all of our findings disseminated there, and have a look at our research pages, because they're nicely navigable now, I think. Just to say, if you could just bear with us for a couple of minutes to give us some feedback as you leave this session, you will be sent to a feedback page. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can make this better next time. Hopefully you will join us. Thank you again for spending your evening with us, and take care, everybody.